phone vibrating against a heavy mahogany desk doesn't sound like a death knell. It sounds like a petty annoyance. When Micah saw his wife's name flashing on the cracked screen, he swiped red. Business first. By the time he finally listened to her voicemail, his empire meant absolutely nothing. The air inside the back office of the Southside meatpacking plant tasted like rust and old ammonia. Micah sat at the head of a folding table that had been draped in an absurdly expensive, dark green felt cloth, a pathetic attempt to give the windowless room the gravity of a boardroom. He rubbed the hinge of his jaw, feeling the familiar, tight knot of muscle there. He had been clenching his teeth for 3 hours. Across from him, Carmine was sweating. The heavy-set enforcer smelled sour, a distinct mixture of cheap garlic, stale fear, and the synthetic pine scent of the car freshener dangling from his leather jacket pocket. Carmine was talking, his hands moving in frantic, pleading circles, trying to explain why a shipment of untaxed cigarettes had mysteriously vanished from a highly secured loading bay. Micah wasn't really listening. He was watching the bead of sweat, charting a jagged course down the deep crease of Carmine's left cheek. The logistics of the lie didn't matter. What mattered was the disrespect. To Micah's immediate right, his phone vibrated against the table. The sound was a harsh, synthetic buzz that cut through Carmine's panicked rambling. Micah shifted his eyes downward without moving his head. The screen illuminated the dim space. Clara. Micah felt a brief, familiar flare of irritation in his chest, a dull ache behind his ribs. Clara knew his schedule. She knew Tuesday afternoons were for collections, dispute resolutions, and the ugly, unglamorous maintenance of the family's revenue streams. She knew he hated being interrupted when he was holding court. It's probably the contractor, Micah thought, his thumb hovering over the device. Or, the security gate is stuck again. Or, she's anxious about the charity dinner tomorrow. Lately, Clara had been retreating into a shell of quiet anxiety. She spent hours wandering their sprawling, empty house, complaining of vague ailments, fatigue, and a deep, unsettling quiet that she said pressed against her ears. Micah had bought her a trip to Milan. He had bought her a new Mercedes. He had hired a private chef. He threw money at the silence, expecting it to act as soundproofing. It hadn't worked. He pressed the small side button on the phone. The screen went black. The buzzing stopped. "So, what you're telling me," Micah said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that forced everyone in the room to lean in to hear him, "is that 2 tons of cargo simply evaporated into the humid air, like magic." "Dom, I swear on my mother," Carmine stammered, his thick fingers twisting the gold chain around his neck. The dock supervisor, he signed off on it, and then the phone vibrated again. This time, it rattled slightly against a stray paperclip on the felt, making a sharp, metallic, scratching noise. Clara. Micah's jaw tightened further. A sharp pain shot up into his temple. The men around the table, Polly, heavily muscled and dead-eyed. Thomas, the accountant, perpetually chewing on a mangled thumbnail, all stared at the glowing rectangle. In their world, a ringing phone during a sit-down was a sign of weakness. It meant a lack of control. It meant the boss answered to someone else. Micah picked up the phone. The metal casing was cool against his warm palm. He didn't look at the screen this time. He just swiped his thumb across the glass, rejecting the call, and then placed the phone face down on the table. The back of the phone case was textured, a ribbed carbon fiber that scraped quietly against the green felt. "Turn your phones off," Micah said to the room, his tone flat, devoid of anger but heavy with consequence. Carmine swallowed hard, the sound audible in the suffocating quiet. "Dom, please, you have until Thursday to find the magic trick that brings my cargo back." "Carmine," Micah interrupted, leaning back in his chair. The metal hinges shrieked in protest. He crossed his arms. "Or I start taking the loss out of your flesh. Roughly $3,000 a pound. You've got enough to spare." Thomas let out a short, nervous exhale that might have been a laugh. Carmine turned a shade of pale gray that made his liver spots stand out like ink blots. Micah felt a hollow sense of satisfaction. It was the same script, the same posturing, the same exhausting theater he had been directing for a decade. He was 42, but his joints felt like they belonged to a man 20 years older. The crown of the city's underbelly was heavy, yes, but mostly it was just incredibly tedious. Underneath his palm, resting flat against the table, the phone buzzed a third time, muffled now. A frantic, trapped insect trying to dig its way through the wood. Micah didn't lift his hand. He pressed down harder, silencing the vibration with sheer physical force, focusing his dead, unblinking stare on Carmine until the heavier man finally broke eye contact and nodded, accepting his sentence. Business was business. Clara would have to wait. She always did. The heavy steel door of the meatpacking plant slammed shut behind Micah, cutting off the industrial hum of the refrigerators. He stepped out onto the loading dock, and the late July heat hit him like a wet, dirty towel. The air was thick, smelling of hot asphalt, diesel fumes, and the faint, rotting tang of the nearby river. Micah loosened his silk tie, pulling the collar of his bespoke shirt away from his damp neck. It was a $3,000 suit, and right now, it felt like a straitjacket. Polly was already at the bottom of the concrete stairs, holding open the heavy rear door of the black Lincoln Navigator. The SUV idled with a low, powerful thrum, a beast waiting in the urban heat. "Back to the house, boss?" Polly asked, his voice rough, eyes scanning the deserted industrial street with ingrained paranoia. "No, take me to the club. I need a drink before I deal with anything else," Micah said, sliding into the cavernous back seat. The interior of the Navigator was a different world. The air conditioning was aggressive, blasting a stream of icy air that smelled faintly of Freon and expensive leather cleaner. The tinted windows turned the glaring, sun-bleached streets of the city into a muted, cinematic blur. Micah sank into the plush captain's chair, feeling the cool leather seep through his damp shirt. The quiet of the cabin was total, engineered to keep the ugly world outside. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The glass screen was smudged with fingerprints and the natural oils of his hand. He tapped it awake. 6 missed calls. 2 were from Clara. 3 were from a number he didn't recognize, a local area code, but not a contact. The last one was a voicemail notification. Micah frowned, a cold, heavy prickle starting at the base of his neck. Clara never called this much. She was prone to silent, sulking, not frantic ringing. If he ignored her once, she usually retreated, wrapping herself in a martyr's silence that he would have to chip away at later over dinner. 6 calls wasn't sulking. 6 calls was a panic attack. He tapped the screen to access his voicemails, bypassing the earpiece and pressing the speaker button. He wanted the open air. He wanted to maintain distance from whatever domestic triviality was about to ruin his brief moment of peace. The automated carrier voice chimed in, bright and artificially cheerful. First unheard message, received at 3:14 p.m. A beat of static. Micah leaned back and closed his eyes. Then, the sound rushed into the quiet cabin of the SUV, entirely wrong for the space. It wasn't the quiet background of their estate. It was chaotic. A harsh, metallic, squeaking rubber soles skidding rapidly on polished linoleum. A rhythmic, sharp beeping, like a piece of heavy machinery backing up, but faster, more urgent. Dumb. Micah's eyes snapped open. Her voice was barely a whisper, thin and ragged, like old paper tearing. It didn't sound like Clara. Clara had a musical, deliberate way of speaking. This voice was scraped hollow. "Dom, please, I'm at Memorial." A sharp, wet intake of breath followed, a sound of profound physical agony that made Micah's stomach drop. They said. It tore. Something tore inside. "It burns, Dom. It burns so bad." In the background of the recording, a heavy door slammed open. A woman's voice, loud and clinical, shouted over Clara. "BP is dropping. 80 over 50 and falling. Get that line in now." "I'm scared," Clara whispered into the phone, her voice fading, drifting away from the microphone. "You didn't answer. I'm so cold. Ply." The phone dropped to the linoleum with a loud digital crack that made Micah flinch. The audio captured a chaotic jumble of scuffling feet, the tearing of fabric, and a man yelling for O-negative blood. The line stayed open for another 10 seconds, recording nothing but the terrifying, impersonal sounds of a trauma team going to war. Then, a click. Silence. Micah stared at the phone in his hand. The screen went dark, reflecting his own face pale, his dark eyes wide and suddenly hollow. He didn't breathe. His lungs felt like they had been filled with wet concrete. The icy air from the vents hit his face, but he was suddenly drenched in a cold, prickling sweat. The heavy lunch he had eaten hours ago turned into a block of lead in his gut. Nausea, sharp and violent, crested in his throat. He tasted battery acid. "Polly," Micah said. The word barely made it past his lips. It was a croak. Polly glanced at the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing at the sight of his boss. "Yeah. Dom? Club? Memorial," Micah said, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, trying to force moisture back into his mouth. "Memorial Hospital. Now, traffic's backed up on the expressway, boss. Might take. Drive over the sidewalks if you have to, Polly," Micah roared, the sudden explosion of volume shattering the engineered peace of the car. He slammed his fist against the leather back of the passenger seat. "Get me to the fucking hospital." The SUV lurched forward as Polly slammed on the gas, the heavy engine roaring in surprise. Micah looked out the window. The city, which a moment ago had felt like his personal chessboard, now looked like a sprawling, indifferent maze designed specifically to keep him away from her. The red taillights of the cars ahead blurred into long, bleeding streaks. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles turning white, the texture of the leather squeaking under his agonizing grip. "It tore," she had said. What tore? She had been complaining of cramps for 3 days. He had told her to take an Advil. He had told her it was stress. He had kissed her forehead, smelled the expensive lavender shampoo in her hair, and told her he had to go to work. He had left her standing in the vast, echoing foyer of their home, clutching her stomach, looking small and pale. The ride took 24 minutes. Micah counted every single one of them. He counted the red lights. He counted the brake lights. He listened to the rhythmic thumping of the tires over the uneven pavement, a metronome counting down a timer he couldn't see. He tried to call her back 3 times. Each time, it went straight to voicemail. He gripped the phone so tightly, the sharp edges of the case bit into his palm, leaving deep, crescent-shaped indentations. The pain was grounding. He focused on it. He prayed for the first time in 20 years, offering vague, nonsensical bargains to a God he only acknowledged during baptisms and funerals. "Take the money. Take the docs. Take Carmine. Just let her be complaining to a nurse about the food right now. Let her be annoyed with me." The navigator jumped the curb in front of the emergency room entrance, the heavy tires crushing a plastic traffic cone. Before the vehicle even came to a complete stop, Micah kicked the heavy door open and threw himself into the suffocating, humid air of the hospital drop-off zone. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room opened with a slow, grinding mechanical scrape that seemed to take an eternity. Micah shoved himself through the gap before the glass had fully parted, his shoulder clipping the frame. The blast of conditioned air inside didn't smell clean. It smelled of industrial pine cleaner, stale coffee, damp wool, and the unmistakable, sharp metallic tang of old blood. The lights overhead were long, caged fluorescent tubes that hummed with an angry electrical vibration, casting a sickly yellow pallor over everything. The waiting room was a portrait of mundane misery. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, occupied by people coughing into their hands, a child wailing with a fever, an old man bleeding quietly into a rag wrapped around his hand. Micah ignored all of it. He walked with long, heavy strides toward the triage desk, a glass-enclosed bunker in the center of the room. A nurse sat behind a thick pane of scratched plexiglass. She was young, wearing cartoon print scrubs, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She was slowly, methodically typing with 2 fingers, a half-eaten blueberry muffin resting on a napkin next to her keyboard. Micah slapped his palm flat against the plexiglass. The plastic rattled violently in its frame. The nurse jumped, her hand flying to her chest. She looked up, her eyes narrowing in irritation, ready to chastise him. But then she saw his face. Whatever she saw there, the sheer, Unadulterated panic masking a man used to inflicting violence made her close her mouth. "Clara Russo," Micah demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. He leaned close to the small speaker grill cut into the glass. "My wife. She was brought in." "Clara Russo." The nurse blinked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Sir, you need to step back and—" "I am not stepping back," Micah said, every word heavy as a stone. "Look up the name. Now." She swallowed quickly and typed. The clacking of the plastic keys echoed loudly in Micah's ears. He watched her eyes dart across the monitor. He saw the exact moment she found the file. Her shoulders dropped slightly. The irritation in her face vanished, instantly replaced by a tight, professional mask of practiced neutrality. It was a look of pity, a look of distance. It was the look you give someone standing on the tracks when the train is already a foot away. "Mr. Russo," she said, her voice dropping an octave, softening. "I'm going to have someone come out and speak with you. If you could please, take a seat in the family consultation room." "Where is she?" Micah demanded, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The rough fabric of his suit pants scratched against his knuckles. "Sir, a doctor will be right with you. Room 3. Just down that hallway to your left." Micah didn't argue. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping numbness. He turned and walked down the corridor. The floor tiles were a speckled, institutional beige, sticky with layers of floor wax. His leather shoes squeaked softly with every step. Room 3 was windowless and suffocatingly small. It was designed for bad news. The wallpaper was a muted floral pattern, peeling slightly at the top left corner. There was a particle board coffee table with a box of cheap, rough-looking tissues placed exactly in the center. A single armchair, upholstered in scratchy blue fabric, sat opposite a small sofa. Micah didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the tissues. He heard the heavy, muffled silence of the hospital pressing in on him. It wasn't the silence of his large house. This silence felt heavy, laden with unsaid words and stopped hearts. The door handle clicked. A doctor walked in. He was young, maybe 35, but he had the deep, bruised bags under his eyes of a man who hadn't slept in a week. He wore green scrubs. Near the hem of his shirt, near the left pocket, there was a dark, wet stain. It was brown at the edges. Micah stared at the stain. He knew what blood looked like when it soaked into cheap cotton. The doctor closed the door quietly behind him. He held a metal clipboard against his chest, a physical shield. "Mr. Russo, I'm Dr. Evans." "Where is she?" Micah asked. He found that he couldn't raise his voice. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. Dr. Evans didn't step further into the room. He stayed near the door. He looked down at the floor, took a slow breath, and looked back up, meeting Micah's eyes directly. "Mr. Russo, your wife suffered a ruptured ectopic pregnancy." Micah blinked. The words sounded like a foreign language. "A what?" "A pregnancy outside the uterus, in the fallopian tube," Dr. Evans said, his tone clinical but gentle. "It ruptured. It caused a massive internal hemorrhage." Micah's brain staggered. Pregnancy. Clara hadn't said anything. She had just complained of cramps. She had been quiet. She was pregnant. He was going to be a father. A warm, terrifying, impossible spark of joy tried to ignite in his chest, instantly smothered by the sterile air of the room. She called me," Micah said, gesturing vaguely toward his pocket, his hand shaking slightly. "She was in pain. But she's here now. You fixed it. Where is her room?" Dr. Evans gripped the clipboard tighter. His knuckles were pale. "Mr. Russo, when your wife arrived, she was already in severe hypovolemic shock. She had lost a catastrophic amount of blood internally. She waited in the triage area for nearly 40 minutes before she collapsed. We rushed her into an emergency laparotomy to stop the bleeding, but..." The doctor stopped. The silence in the room stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire about to snap. But her heart gave out on the table. Dr. Evans finished softly. "We attempted resuscitation for 45 minutes. We pushed every medication we had. We shocked her. but there was simply not enough blood volume left to sustain cardiac function. "I am so deeply sorry. She's gone." Micah didn't move. He didn't scream. He didn't flip the particle board table or punch a hole in the peeling floral wallpaper. The dramatic, violent reactions of his world felt utterly useless here, entirely inadequate. Instead, a profound, terrifying stillness washed over him. He slowly reached out and placed his hand on the back of the scratchy blue armchair. He felt the coarse texture of the cheap synthetic fabric against his fingertips. He traced the weave of the material. Up, down, left, right. His brain retreated from the massive, crushing reality of the room, focusing entirely on the tiny, meaningless friction against his skin. She waited in the triage area. She had been sitting out there, bleeding to death from the inside out, sitting on those hard plastic chairs. She had been calling him. He had been watching Carmine sweat over stolen cigarettes. "Mr. Russo," Dr. Evans asked softly, taking a half step forward. "Is there someone I can call for you?" Micah looked at the doctor. The young man's face blurred, swimming in and out of focus. Micah opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried again. "She called me," Micah whispered, the sound barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "I'm sorry?" "She called me," Micah repeated, his voice cracking, the realization finally breaking through the numbness, flooding his system with a toxic, paralyzing dose of pure self-hatred. "And I silenced the phone. Because I was busy." Dr. Evans said nothing. There was nothing to say. Micah's knees gave out. He didn't fall dramatically. He simply folded inward, a building collapsing its own foundation. He hit the floor hard, the linoleum jarring his bones. He knelt there, in the center of the windowless room, amidst the smell of bleach and sorrow. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until he saw bursts of white light. But the image wouldn't go away. Carmine's sweating face, the textured back of his phone case, the green felt table. He had traded his wife's life for a few boxes of untaxed cigarettes. By nightfall, Micah Russo still owned the docks. He still commanded 300 men. He still had a bank account that swelled by the hour. But, as he knelt on the sticky floor of Memorial Hospital, entirely alone, he knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that he had nothing left. He was a king, reigning over an empire of ash. The ride back to the estate was a blur of muted colors and the steady, rhythmic thumping of the tires against the asphalt. Paulie drove in, absolute silence. He had turned the air conditioning off, perhaps realizing that the manufactured chill was no longer a comfort, or perhaps afraid that the blowing vents would mask a sound he needed to hear from the back seat. Micah made no sound. He sat, slumped against the passenger door, his forehead pressed against the cool, tinted glass. The vibrations of the road rattled through his skull. He watched the city roll by the neon signs flickering in the fading light, the pedestrians hurrying down the sidewalks, the exhaust pluming from city buses. The world was spinning on its axis, completely indifferent to the fact that his had just stopped completely. When the heavy iron gates of his driveway groaned open, Micah felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea. The house loomed at the end of the circular gravel drive. It was a sprawling, 3-story Tudor monstrosity of brick and dark timber. He had bought it 5 years ago because it looked like money. It looked like power. Now, staring at the dark, unlit windows on the second floor, it just looked like a mausoleum. Paulie parked the Navigator near the grand entrance. He put the vehicle in park, the transmission clunking softly. He turned around, his thick neck straining against his collar. "Dom," Paulie started, his voice rough, trying to navigate emotional terrain he was entirely unequipped for. "Do you want me to come in? Call someone? Make some coffee?" "Leave the keys," Micah whispered. He didn't look at Paulie. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany front doors. "Boss, I don't think you should be." "Leave the fucking keys, Paulie," Micah said, his voice flat, stripped of its usual booming authority, yet infinitely heavier. Paulie swallowed, dropped the heavy key fob into the cup holder, and climbed out of the SUV. He walked down the long driveway on foot, his shoulders hunched, leaving his boss alone in the encroaching dusk. Micah let himself into the house. The security system beeped a high-pitched, cheerful trill demanding its code. He punched the numbers in with heavy, clumsy fingers. 30 seconds of grace before the sirens wailed. He disabled it. The house plunged into a profound, suffocating quiet. Clara had been right. The silence didn't just exist here. It pressed. It felt like a physical weight against his eardrums, thick and heavy, like water. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked through the cavernous foyer, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble. The sound echoed, bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings, mocking him with his own isolation. He wandered into the kitchen. The air here smelled faintly of roasted espresso beans and sliced lemons, the remnants of the morning. On the massive granite island, there was a glass of water. A ring of condensation dried into the stone beneath it. Next to it lay a small notepad. Micah approached it slowly, feeling like he was walking through wet cement. It was a grocery list, written in Clara's looping, hurried cursive with a black gel pen. Almond milk, shallots, the good butter. Call the florist about the centerpieces. He stared at the loops of her letters. He reached out and pressed his index finger against the ink. His hand was trembling so violently that he smudged the word butter. The triviality of the list broke something fundamental inside his chest. She had been planning for tomorrow. She had been thinking about dinner. She had been living, entirely unaware that the clock was already winding down. A sharp, ragged sound tore out of Micah's throat. It wasn't a dignified cry. It was an ugly, wet gasp. The sound of a drowning man breaching the surface for a singular, desperate second. He staggered out of the kitchen, his lungs burning, and made his way up the sweeping oak staircase. He gripped the polished banister tightly, feeling the wood grain beneath his palm. It was solid, unforgiving. Their bedroom was immaculate, except for a pair of soft, gray fleece sweatpants discarded casually over the back of a reading chair. Clara's sweatpants. Micah collapsed to his knees in front of the chair. He grabbed the fabric, burying his face in the soft fleece. It smelled of her. Lavender, expensive vanilla lotion, and the warm human scent of sleep. He inhaled so deeply his ribs ached. He didn't weep like a movie character. He hyperventilated. Saliva pooled in his mouth. Mucus ran from his nose, soaking into the gray fabric. He choked on his own breath, his broad shoulders heaving, curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the plush carpet. He was a man who ordered broken bones without blinking. He had watched men beg for their lives and felt absolutely nothing. But kneeling here, clutching a pair of $20 sweatpants, he was utterly, helplessly destroyed. In the pocket of his suit jacket, his burner phone vibrated. The harsh, synthetic buzz was an obscene intrusion. It was the rhythm of his empire, demanding his attention. Micah pulled his face from the fabric. His eyes were bloodshot, his face wet and swollen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cheap plastic device. The screen glowed in the dim room. Incoming call. Thomas, the accountant, calling about the wire transfers for the offshore accounts. Millions of dollars moving through the digital ether. Micah stared at the ringing phone. The contradiction of his existence laid itself bare. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of money, fear, and influence. He had believed it made him untouchable. He had believed he was providing for her, building a kingdom, for a family he hadn't even known was starting to grow. And yet all the money in his vast, untraceable accounts couldn't buy him 5 minutes to drive her to the hospital. All his soldiers couldn't shoot the hemorrhage inside her. His power was an illusion, a costume he wore while the real world bled out on a linoleum floor. With a roar that tore the lining of his throat, Micah hurled the phone. It struck the heavy, antique vanity mirror across the room. The mirror didn't shatter. It simply cracked. A dense, silver spiderweb fractured across the glass, splitting his dim, pathetic reflection into 100 broken pieces. The phone clattered to the floor, dead. Micah leaned back against the legs of the reading chair, the fleece pants still clutched in his fist, and let the darkness of the room swallow him whole. Hours bled into one another. Nightfall descended completely, turning the sprawling estate into a shadow box. Micah hadn't moved. The muscles in his legs had cramped, a dull, throbbing pain in his calves and thighs, but he welcomed the discomfort. It was a grounding physical sensation in a reality that felt entirely detached. He was sitting in the dark of his ground-floor study now. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the dried blood on his knuckles from where he had scraped his hand against the floorboards upstairs. He sat in his heavy executive chair, staring at the polished mahogany surface of his desk. It looked exactly like the table at the meatpacking plant. Outside, the sweep of headlights cut through the gloom of the study. The gravel crunched under the heavy tires of an approaching vehicle. Micah didn't blink. He didn't reach for the revolver tucked into the top drawer of his desk. He simply sat, a ghost haunting his own life. The heavy front door opened. He hadn't locked it. Footsteps echoed in the foyer, heavy, purposeful, and trying to be quiet. "Dom?" a voice called out, tentative but laced with a simmering, violent energy. It was Carmine. The heavy oak doors of the study pushed open. Carmine stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway chandelier. Behind him stood Polly, looking deeply uncomfortable. Carmine stepped into the dark room, his breathing heavy. He smelled of cheap cologne, stale sweat, and adrenaline. "Boss," Carmine said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. Polly said, "Well, he said you were home. We didn't want to bother you, given the circumstances." Carmine stumbled over the words, terrified of acknowledging the tragedy, but desperate to deliver his news. Micah remained silent. His eyes were adjusted to the dark. He could see the gleam of the gold chain resting on Carmine's chest. He could see the eager, predatory tilt of the enforcer's heavy jaw. "We found him, Dom," Carmine pushed on, emboldened by the silence. "The missing cigarettes. It was a crew out of the East End, trying to test the waters, see if we were asleep at the wheel. We got the trucks back, and we got the 3 guys who drove them." Carmine took a step closer, resting his thick hands on the edge of Micah's mahogany desk. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a gravelly whisper. "We got 'em tied to chairs in the basement of the Elm Street warehouse, just waiting on you, boss. Say the word. We'll make an example out of 'em. Take it out on their kneecaps. Nobody steals from Micah Russo and walks away." Carmine was offering a gift. He was offering violence as a balm for grief. In their world, when you hurt, you made someone else bleed. It was the only therapy they understood. Carmine stood there, vibrating with violent anticipation, waiting for the king to issue an execution order. Micah looked at Carmine, really looked at him. He looked at the sweat on the man's forehead. He looked at the tacky pinky ring catching the faint light from the hall. He looked at the absolute, profound stupidity of it all. They were fighting over untaxed tobacco. They were tying men to chairs in damp basements over pieces of paper with numbers printed on them. They were playing a pathetic, ugly game of make-believe kings, entirely convinced of their own importance. And for this game, Micah had let his wife die alone in a hallway. "Let them go," Micah said. The words were so quiet, so devoid of emotion, that Carmine blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, boss. You want me to handle it quiet?" "I want you to untie them," Micah said, his voice a flat, dead monotone. "Give them the trucks. Tell them to keep the cargo. Let them go." Carmine recoiled as if he had been slapped. His jaw dropped. "Dom, boss, you can't be serious. They disrespected the family. If we let them walk, we look weak. The Russians will be on our throats by morning. We'll lose the docks." "Let them take the docks," Micah replied, not breaking eye contact. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. He sounded profoundly, fundamentally, exhausted. "Let them take the warehouse. I don't care, Carmine. I don't care about any of it." Polly shifted nervously in the doorway, realizing something was terribly, fundamentally broken. "Dom, you're in shock. Let us handle this tonight. You rest." "Get out," Micah whispered. "Boss, get out of my house," Micah suddenly roared, the sudden explosion of volume shattering the stillness of the room. He slammed both fists onto the mahogany desk, the wood rattling violently under the impact. "Take the trucks. Take the money. Take the whole fucking city and choke on it. Get out." Carmine scrambled backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disgust. He was looking at a man who had lost his mind, a boss who had lost his nerve. In their world, that was a terminal diagnosis. Without another word, Carmine and Polly backed out of the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. A minute later, the crunch of gravel signaled their departure. They wouldn't be back. By tomorrow, the wolves would circle. The empire would be carved up. Micah didn't care. He slumped back into his leather chair. The silence of the house settled over him again, heavier than before. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out his personal phone. The screen was cracked from where he had gripped it too tightly in the hospital waiting room. He unlocked it. He opened his voicemails. He found the message from 3:14 p.m. He pressed play. The chaotic noises of the emergency room filled the dark, quiet study. The squeaking shoes, the frantic beeping, and then her voice, thin, ragged, begging for him. "I'm scared." "You didn't answer." The message ended. Silence returned. Micah pressed play again. He sat alone in the dark, the architect of his own hell, a king ruling over absolutely nothing, listening to the sound of his wife dying. He listened to it over and over and over again, the faint blue light of the screen illuminating the tears drying on his face, until the battery finally died and the screen faded to black. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. We all get caught up in the grind, but Micah's tragic realization proves that ambition means nothing if you lose your reason for living. Share this video to remind someone to pick up the phone when it matters most. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more gritty, grounded storytelling. What's one call you're glad you didn't ignore? Let us know in the comments down below.